It started as a regular day for Michael Carter, a highly respected attorney who had built a career on standing up for justice. Dressed sharply in a tailored suit, Michael walked into one of the city's upscale car dealerships. He was there to treat himself after closing a major case, one of those rare moments where he allowed himself to celebrate his hard work. But what should have been a straightforward and joyful experience quickly turned into something he'd never forget. The dealership was bustling with activity. Sales associates were chatting with potential buyers, the smell of new leather filled the air, and the glimmer of luxury cars shone under the showroom lights. Michael made his way to the front desk, ready to inquire about a specific car he'd researched. That's when he noticed the first hint of trouble. A security guard, a tall man with a stern demeanor, had been watching him from the moment he entered. At first, Michael dismissed it. He figured the guard was just doing his job. But as he moved closer to one of the cars on display, the guard's gaze hardened. Then, as Michael extended his hand to open the car door, the man stepped in. "Sir, can I help you?" the guard asked, his voice sharp and unwelcoming. Michael smiled politely. "I'm just looking at this model. I'd like to speak with a sales associate when one is available." The guard didn't budge. Instead, he took a step closer, invading Michael's space. "This area is restricted. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Michael froze for a moment, confused. He glanced around the showroom. No one else seemed to be questioned, despite several other customers browsing freely. "I'm pretty sure I am," he replied calmly. "This is a car dealership, isn't it?" The guard's lips tightened into a thin line. "I'm going to need to see some ID," he demanded. Now, Michael was no stranger to uncomfortable encounters, had faced his share of bias and discrimination over the years. But this felt different. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a challenge to his dignity. "Why would you need my ID just for me to look at a car?" he asked, his tone still controlled but firm. Instead of answering, the guard's hand hovered near his radio, signaling that things might escalate if Michael didn't comply. At this point, a few people in the showroom had started to notice, their murmurs filling the air. But no one intervened. Feeling the weight of the moment, Michael reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and handed over his driver's license. The guard glanced at it briefly, but instead of apologizing or stepping aside, he doubled down. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said, his voice devoid of explanation. "Leave? On what grounds?" Michael asked, now incredulous. But the guard didn't answer. He simply gestured toward the door, signaling that the conversation was over. Michael looked around again, hoping for someone, anyone, to step in and say something. But all he saw were blank stares and awkward avoidance. For a moment, he considered walking away, sparing himself further humiliation. But then a thought struck him. If he walked out now, without standing up for himself, what message would that send? What happened next would spark a chain of events that neither Michael nor the dealership could have anticipated. It was a moment that would not only test his patience, but also his resolve to fight for what was right. And as the tension in the air grew thicker, Michael made a decision that would set the stage for a confrontation no one in that room would forget. Michael stood his ground, staring back at the security guard with calm but unwavering determination. The room seemed to hold its breath, the soft hum of the dealership suddenly feeling louder in the awkward silence. He wasn't about to back down. "I'd like to speak with your manager," Michael said, his voice steady despite the tension rising in his chest. The guard folded his arms, clearly unimpressed. "The manager's busy. You need to leave now," he repeated, this time louder, as if trying to draw more attention to the situation. Michael could feel the eyes on him. Some people were peeking over brochures, while others whispered to each other. He noticed a sales associate in the corner who seemed hesitant, almost as though they wanted to intervene but didn't dare. Michael had experienced moments like this before, situations where he was forced to prove his worth simply because of how he looked. "Busy or not, I'll wait for the manager," Michael replied firmly. "I'm a customer, just like everyone else here, and I have a right to be treated with respect." The guard scoffed, his patience wearing thin. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to do here, but you're making people uncomfortable. You need to go." The accusation hit Michael like a slap. Uncomfortable, he glanced around again. Sure, some people were visibly uneasy, but not because of him. It was the escalating scene, the raised voice of the guard, the obvious imbalance of power. He took a deep breath, trying to center himself. This wasn't the time to lose his composure, no matter how unjust the situation felt. "Uncomfortable," he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I walked into this dealership to look at a car. That's it. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't caused a scene. So if anyone's uncomfortable, maybe it's because you're treating me differently than everyone else here." For a moment, the guard seemed taken aback, as if Michael's words had landed harder than expected. But the moment passed quickly, and his expression hardened once more. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he shot back. "Leave now, or I'll call the police." The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. Michael's pulse quickened, but he refused to let the fear show. He had spent years as a lawyer, fighting for people in situations where they felt powerless. Now he found himself in a similar position, and he knew this was a test of everything he stood for. "Call them," Michael said evenly, locking eyes with the guard. "But I'm not leaving until I get an explanation or a chance to speak with the manager." The room buzzed with whispered conversations. A few people had even pulled out their phones, recording the confrontation from a distance. Michael couldn't help but wonder what they were thinking. Were they on his side? Or were they just capturing content for their social media feeds, indifferent to the stakes? A sudden voice broke through the tension. "What's going on here?" Michael turned to see a middle-aged man in a suit walking toward them. His name tag read Kevin, General Manager. Relief mixed with frustration flooded through Michael. Finally, someone in authority had arrived. The guard straightened up, clearly trying to frame the narrative before Michael could speak. "This man was acting suspiciously near one of the vehicles. I asked him to leave, but he refused." Michael felt a spark of anger rise. "That's not what happened," he said firmly, stepping forward. "I walked in here like anyone else, looking to buy a car. This man singled me out, demanded my ID without cause, and now he's trying to throw me out without reason." Kevin glanced between the two men, his brow furrowed. "All right, let's all take a step back." "Sir," he said, addressing Michael, "I apologize if there's been a misunderstanding. Let's talk this through calmly." Michael appreciated the attempt at diplomacy, but it felt hollow. "A misunderstanding," he echoed, his voice steady but sharp. "Is that what you call it when your security assumes I don't belong here before I've even had a chance to speak with a sales associate?" Kevin's face flushed slightly, and he looked toward the guard, who shifted uncomfortably but didn't speak. "Look, I'm sure no harm was meant," Kevin began, clearly trying to defuse the situation. "Why don't we start over? I'd be happy to show you some of our vehicles myself." Michael wasn't satisfied. This wasn't just about looking at cars anymore. It was about the principle. "I appreciate that," he said, "but before we move forward, I think it's important we address what just happened here. This isn't the first time someone like me has been treated like this, and I'm tired of pretending it's okay." Kevin's expression grew more serious. He seemed to realize that the situation wasn't going to be swept under the rug. "You're absolutely right," he admitted after a pause. "I'll speak with the security team about this, but for now, let's focus on making sure you're taken care of as a customer." Michael nodded slowly. He wasn't sure if that was enough, but it was a start. He followed Kevin further into the showroom, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on his back. The moment was far from over. He knew that much. As they walked, Michael couldn't help but think about how often these subtle forms of discrimination went unchecked. It wasn't always blatant or overt, but the message was clear. People like him were often judged before they even had a chance to prove themselves. Little did anyone in that dealership know, this wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. For Michael, this was more than a bad experience. It was a catalyst. a reminder of why he had chosen his profession in the first place. And as he sat down with Kevin to discuss the car he had initially come to see, a plan was already forming in his mind. This wasn't just going to end with an apology. It was going to be a lesson, one that no one involved would ever forget. As Michael sat across from Kevin, the dealership manager, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered from the confrontation. Kevin was doing his best to appear apologetic, offering polite smiles and trying to steer the conversation toward cars and financing options, but Michael wasn't ready to let the incident slide. "So, tell me about this model," Michael said, gesturing toward the brochure on the desk. He kept his tone even, but his mind was still racing. This wasn't just about buying a car anymore. This was about setting a precedent. Kevin launched into a detailed explanation of the car's features, clearly trying to pivot the situation back into neutral territory. Michael nodded occasionally, making mental notes, but his focus was split. He couldn't help but notice the security guard watching him from across the showroom, arms folded and eyes still sharp. Michael decided to push the conversation back toward what mattered. "Kevin," he said, interrupting the manager mid-sentence, "I appreciate you showing me this car, but I can't ignore what just happened out there. Your security guard didn't just question me. He assumed I didn't belong here. That kind of treatment isn't acceptable." Kevin hesitated, his rehearsed sales pitch faltering. "I understand how you feel, Mr. Carter," he said carefully. "And I truly apologize for any offense caused. It's not how we operate here." Michael raised an eyebrow. "It's not how you operate? Then why did it happen? This isn't the first time I've walked into a place like this and been treated like a suspect instead of a customer. Do you think that's a coincidence?" Kevin looked uncomfortable, his confidence wavering. "I can't speak to what was in anyone's head," he said, "but I can assure you we value every customer who walks through our doors." Michael leaned back, studying Kevin's expression. It was clear the manager wanted to move past this as quickly as possible, but Michael wasn't about to let it go that easily. "Words are one thing," he said. "Actions are another. What's going to happen to that security guard? Is he going to get a slap on the wrist and be back here tomorrow, treating the next black customer the same way?" Kevin's face reddened, and for a moment he didn't respond. Michael could tell he was walking a fine line, trying to protect the dealership's image while avoiding further escalation. "I'll address the situation internally," Kevin said finally. "You have my word on that." Michael nodded slowly, though he wasn't convinced. He had heard promises like this before, and they rarely led to meaningful change. Still, he decided not to press further for now. Instead, he shifted his focus back to the car, listening as Kevin outlined the financing options and additional features. But even as he nodded along, his mind was elsewhere. Meanwhile, across the room, the security guard watched the interaction with a mixture of frustration and unease. To him, the whole thing had gotten out of hand. He hadn't intended for it to escalate, but something about Michael's calm defiance had rubbed him the wrong way. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Back at the desk, Kevin wrapped up his pitch, handing Michael a glossy brochure. "Take your time to think it over," he said with a forced smile. "We'd love to have your business." Michael took the brochure and stood up, meeting Kevin's gaze. "I'll think about it," he said. "But before I go, I'd like the name and contact information of the dealership's owner." Kevin blinked, caught off guard. "The owner?" he repeated. "I'm not sure that's necessary. I can assure you I'll handle everything personally." Michael gave him a polite but firm smile. "I'm sure you will, but I'd still like the contact information." Reluctantly, Kevin scribbled down a name and email address on a business card, handing it over. Michael pocketed it, thanked him, and walked out of the office. As he made his way back through the showroom, he could feel the weight of the security guard's glare on him. But Michael didn't falter. Instead, he stopped by the front desk, asking the receptionist for the dealership's customer service line. He jotted down the number and left the building, his mind already piecing together his next steps. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Michael stood by his car for a moment, taking a deep breath. The confrontation had drained him, but it had also lit a fire inside him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the countless others who had faced similar treatment and walked away, defeated and unseen. Over the next few days, Michael dug deeper into the dealership's history. He found reviews online that painted a picture of a place that wasn't always as welcoming as it claimed to be. Several comments mentioned rude staff, and while none were as explicit as what he had experienced, the patterns were there. Michael also reached out to the dealership owner, detailing the incident and expressing his concerns. To his surprise, he received a prompt reply, inviting him to discuss the matter further. It was a small step, but it gave Michael hope that this story might lead to change. As the days went on, Michael found himself replaying the encounter in his mind. He thought about the guard, the manager, and the other customers who had stood by, saying nothing. He thought about how easy it would have been to walk away, to brush it off as just another bad experience. But he also thought about his clients, people who had faced injustice and chosen to fight back, even when the odds were stacked against them. They were his inspiration, and now he had a chance to lead by example. This wasn't just about buying a car anymore. It was about standing up to a system that too often turned a blind eye to discrimination. It was about holding people accountable and demanding better, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And as Michael prepared for his next steps, he knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. The dealership owner, a man named Richard Lewis, was quick to arrange a meeting with Michael. It was clear from his response that he wanted to handle the matter quietly, perhaps to avoid any bad publicity. The meeting was scheduled for a weekday afternoon in a private office at the dealership, and Michael arrived prepared. He brought a detailed account of the incident, the online reviews he had uncovered, and a clear set of expectations for how the situation should be addressed. As Michael walked back into the dealership, he noticed some familiar faces: the same receptionist, a few of the sales associates, and even the security guard. The guard gave him a sharp look, but this time he didn't approach. Michael could feel a tension in the air, but he kept his head high and his steps steady as he was escorted to Richard's office. Richard greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was a polished man in his late 50s, dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of wealth and authority. "Mr. Carter, thank you for coming," he said, extending a hand. "I've heard about the incident, and I want to personally apologize for any distress it caused." Michael shook his hand, but didn't return the smile. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me," he said, "but this isn't just about an apology. It's about addressing a pattern of behavior that shouldn't be happening here or anywhere." Richard nodded, gesturing for Michael to sit. "Of course. Please tell me everything from your perspective." Michael recounted the events in detail, laying out not only the actions of the security guard, but also the lack of intervention from others in the dealership. He spoke calmly but firmly, making it clear that this wasn't just about his personal experience. "This kind of treatment sends a message," he said, "and it's not a message anyone should have to receive." Richard listened intently, his expression serious. When Michael finished, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I understand your concerns," he said after a pause, "and I want to assure you that we take this very seriously. I've already spoken with Kevin and the security team, and we're implementing mandatory training to ensure something like this doesn't happen again." Michael appreciated the gesture, but he wasn't convinced it was enough. "Training is a start," he said, "but what about accountability? What happens to the people who made those decisions in the first place?" Richard's face tightened slightly. "Disciplinary actions will be taken," he said, "but I believe in addressing the root of the problem, not just punishing individuals. We want to create a culture of inclusivity and respect." Michael leaned forward, holding Richard's gaze. "That's a noble goal," he said, "but intentions don't change behavior. Actions do. And I need to see proof that those actions are being taken." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Michael's words hanging in the air. Richard seemed to sense that this wasn't a conversation he could rush or downplay. "You're absolutely right," he said finally. "We'll put together a plan, and I'd like your input on it. If you're willing, we could even work with your firm to develop policies that set a standard for how we treat all our customers." Michael was caught off guard by the offer. It was a bold move, one that suggested Richard wasn't just trying to placate him, but genuinely wanted to make amends. Still, Michael couldn't help but wonder if it was just a tactic to avoid further scrutiny. "I'll consider it," he said cautiously. "But first, I need to know that the immediate issues are being addressed. That means transparency and accountability, not just promises." Richard nodded. "You have my word." As Michael left the office, he felt a mixture of hope and skepticism. The meeting had gone better than he expected, but he wasn't naive. Words were easy, change was hard. And while Richard seemed genuine, Michael knew it would take more than a single conversation to dismantle the biases. Over the next few days, Michael kept a close eye on the dealership. He noticed changes, small ones at first. The security guard was no longer stationed at the main entrance, and the staff seemed more attentive and polite. But Michael also began to receive messages from others who had seen the video of the confrontation, which had started circulating online. Some shared their own stories of being mistreated at the dealership, while others thanked him for standing up for what was right. One message, in particular, stood out. It was from a former employee of the dealership who claimed that the security guard in question had a history of targeting certain customers. The message included details that made Michael's stomach turn, stories of other incidents that had been swept under the rug, complaints that had been ignored. Michael decided to dig deeper, using his legal expertise to gather evidence and testimonies. What he uncovered was troubling, a pattern of behavior that extended beyond the security guard. There were reports of discriminatory practices in hiring, complaints about biased treatment from sales staff, and even allegations of unequal financing offers based on race. Armed with this new information, Michael knew he had to take action. The meeting with Richard had been a step in the right direction, but this was bigger than a single dealership. It was about holding an entire system accountable. He began drafting a legal strategy, reaching out to the people who had shared their stories with him. Together, they started to build a case, not just against the dealership, but against the culture of discrimination that allowed such practices to persist. As the pieces began to fall into place, Michael felt the tension mounting. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, backlash, and attempts to discredit him and the others who had come forward. But he also knew he couldn't back down. This wasn't just about justice for himself. It was about justice for everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible or unwelcome. And as he prepared for what was to come, Michael felt a surge of determination. The fight was far from over, but he was ready. The question now wasn't whether he would win, it was how far the truth would go when it finally came to light. As Michael gathered evidence and built his case, he began to notice something strange. Calls from potential witnesses that had previously been consistent were starting to dwindle. People who had initially been eager to share their stories suddenly became hesitant, their tones guarded and their words careful. Some even stopped responding altogether. It was as if a shadow had fallen over his efforts, chilling the momentum he had worked so hard to build. At first, Michael chalked it up to nerves. It wasn't uncommon for people to feel uneasy about coming forward, especially in situations involving powerful businesses. But when one of his key witnesses, a former employee of the dealership, reached out with a cryptic voicemail, Michael's instincts told him there was more to the story. "I can't talk anymore," the voice said, low and hurried. "I've been approached. I think it's best if I just stay out of this. I'm sorry, Michael. Be careful." Michael listened to the message twice, trying to piece together what the man meant by approached. Had someone from the dealership pressured him into silence? Or was it something more subtle, like an implied threat? Either way, it was clear that forces were working behind the scenes to undermine the case. Determined to get answers, Michael decided to reach out to another former employee who had also shared concerns about the dealership's practices. But when he called, the phone rang and rang, eventually going to voicemail. He tried again later that day, only to be met with the same result. Feeling the pressure mounting, Michael began digging deeper into the dealership's operations, looking for connections that might explain the sudden resistance. What he found left him stunned. The dealership was part of a larger corporate network, a sprawling organization with ties to influential figures in the community. This wasn't just a local business, it was a piece of a much larger puzzle, one that had the resources and reach to protect itself at all costs. Michael realized that his fight wasn't just against a single dealership or a biased security guard. It was against an entire system that thrived on power and influence. The stakes had just been raised, and the weight of what he was up against began to sink in. Around the same time, a surprise development added another layer of complexity. Michael received an email from a whistleblower who claimed to work within the corporate network that owned the dealership. The email was anonymous, but it contained detailed information about internal policies and practices that seemed to corroborate much of what Michael had already uncovered. "Be careful who you trust," the email warned. "There are people watching this case closely. They'll do whatever it takes to protect their reputation. I've seen it happen before." The message sent a chill down Michael's spine. He had always known that taking on a powerful organization would be challenging, but this was something else entirely. The stakes weren't just professional anymore, they were personal. Michael decided to meet with his team to strategize their next steps. Sitting around the conference table, his colleagues looked at him with a mixture of determination and concern. "If what this whistleblower says is true," one of them said, "we're dealing with something much bigger than we thought. We need to tread carefully." Michael nodded. "Carefully, yes," he said, "but we can't back down. If anything, this makes it even more important to see this through." As they discussed their strategy, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The dealership and its corporate backers were likely working just as hard to discredit him, and the pressure was mounting from all sides. Then, just as the meeting was wrapping up, Michael's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news alert, and the headline made his heart sink. "Local dealership accused of discrimination denies allegations, claims defamation." The article included statements from Richard Lewis, the dealership owner, who framed the incident as a misunderstanding and accused Michael of attempting to tarnish the company's reputation for personal gain. It was a bold move, one clearly designed to turn public opinion against him. Michael knew he couldn't let the narrative spiral out of control. He needed to act fast, to push back with the truth before the dealership's version of events gained traction. But as he stared at the article, another thought struck him. If the dealership was willing to go this far, what else were they capable of? The battle lines were drawn, and Michael was more determined than ever to fight. But with each passing moment, the stakes grew higher, the challenges more daunting. The question wasn't just whether he could win, it was whether he could do so without losing himself in the process. And as the pieces of the puzzle continued to shift, Michael found himself standing on the brink of a decision that would shape the outcome of everything. The truth was closer than ever, but so was the danger. And for the first time, Michael realized that the fight ahead might cost him more than he had ever imagined. The day of the hearing arrived, the courtroom buzzing with quiet anticipation. Michael sat at the plaintiff's table, surrounded by his team, a stack of evidence neatly arranged before them. Across the aisle sat Richard Lewis, flanked by a team of high-powered attorneys representing the dealership and its corporate parent. The air was heavy with tension, the stakes unmistakable. Michael's heart raced as the proceedings began. His opening statement was clear and powerful, outlining the pattern of discrimination and systemic neglect that allowed such behavior to persist. He walked the court through the incident, the history of complaints, and the evidence collected from the anonymous whistleblower. Every word was precise, every argument designed to shine a light on the truth. The defense, however, came prepared. They painted Michael as a disgruntled individual seeking to exploit a misunderstanding for personal gain. They challenged the credibility of the whistleblower's evidence, questioning its authenticity and relevance. Their arguments were sharp, their confidence unshaken. But Michael had anticipated their strategy. When it was his turn to present witnesses, he brought forward individuals who had worked at the dealership and experienced similar treatment. Each testimony built on the next, creating a compelling narrative that was hard to dismiss. The most powerful moment came when Michael introduced the anonymous whistleblower who had decided to come forward publicly despite the risks. The whistleblower's testimony was damning. They detailed internal emails and policies that demonstrated a pattern of bias, revealing how complaints were routinely ignored or dismissed. The courtroom was silent as the whistleblower described how employees were pressured to prioritize image over accountability, a culture that enabled discrimination to flourish unchecked. Richard Lewis shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the evidence mounted. His confident demeanor began to crack, replaced by a flicker of unease. The courtroom felt electric, the momentum clearly on Michael's side. As the hearing progressed, it became clear that the defense was struggling to counter the weight of the evidence. Their attempts to discredit Michael and the whistleblower fell flat, their arguments sounding increasingly hollow. By the time closing arguments were made, the tension in the room was palpable. The judge called for a brief recess before delivering the ruling, and Michael stepped outside to gather his thoughts. He stared at the horizon, a mix of anticipation and exhaustion washing over him. This fight had been longer and harder than he'd ever imagined, but now the end was finally in sight. When the court reconvened, the judge's decision was clear and decisive. The dealership and its corporate parent were found liable for discrimination, with orders to implement significant reforms and pay restitution to affected individuals. The ruling was a victory, not just for Michael, but for everyone who had been silenced or ignored. As the courtroom emptied, Michael felt a wave of relief and pride. He had stood up against a powerful system and won. But just as he was beginning to process the moment, the whistleblower approached him, their expression grave. "There's something I didn't mention in court," they said quietly. "I didn't think it was relevant at first, but now I'm not so sure." Michael frowned, his curiosity piqued. "What is it?" The whistleblower hesitated, then handed him a folder. "It's about the security guard. He wasn't just acting on his own. There's more to his story than we realized." Michael opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. What he saw made his stomach drop. The security guard had been hired through a third-party firm with a history of questionable practices, including targeting certain demographics under the guise of loss prevention. The implications were staggering. It wasn't just the dealership at fault, but a broader network of systemic issues that extended far beyond what Michael had uncovered in court. As the weight of this new information settled over him, Michael realized that the fight wasn't over. He had won an important battle, but the war against discrimination and systemic injustice was far from finished. Standing in the empty courtroom, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. The truth had come to light, but there was still more to uncover, more to challenge, and more to change. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly be difficult, he knew he was ready to face whatever came next. This was only the beginning. The courtroom was nearly empty now, the echoes of the decision still fresh in Michael's mind. As he held the folder containing new evidence about the security firm, a mix of emotions swirled within him. Relief from the victory in court mingled with the weight of what he'd just uncovered. He had thought the fight was over, but the truth was clearer than ever. The roots of systemic injustice ran deeper than one dealership or one company. Michael stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, the sunlight momentarily blinding him. Reporters waited eagerly, their cameras and microphones aimed in his direction. He had prepared a statement, but as he walked toward the crowd, he realized he didn't need a script. This moment wasn't about rehearsed words, it was about speaking from the heart. "Today's ruling is a victory for justice," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But it's just one step. The fight against discrimination is far from over, and we have a responsibility to keep pushing for change, not just in our communities, but in the systems that shape them. This isn't about pointing fingers. It's about holding ourselves accountable and building a future where fairness and respect are the norm, not the exception. The reporters fired off questions, but Michael kept his answers concise, focusing on the broader message rather than the specifics of the case. He knew the media would twist and dissect his words, but he hoped the essence of his message would resonate with those watching. After the press conference, Michael returned to his office, where his team waited to celebrate. They had worked tirelessly alongside him, and their joy was palpable. The atmosphere was warm, filled with laughter and shared relief. For the first time in weeks, Michael allowed himself to relax, letting the weight of the fight slip away, if only for a moment. But even as the celebration unfolded, the folder from the whistleblower remained on his desk, a silent reminder that the work wasn't finished. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Michael sat alone in his office, poring over the documents. The more he read, the more disturbed he became. The security firm's practices weren't just unethical, they were dangerous. Policies that encouraged racial profiling were disguised as efficiency measures, and internal memos revealed a chilling disregard for basic human dignity. Michael knew he couldn't ignore what he had found. The case against the dealership might have been won, but this new revelation called for action. He began drafting letters to regulatory agencies, outlining the evidence and calling for an investigation into the firm. He also reached out to colleagues who specialized in systemic reform, knowing that this fight would require expertise and resources far beyond his own. In the weeks that followed, Michael's life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the impact of the case lingered. Messages poured in from people across the country, some sharing their own experiences with discrimination, others expressing gratitude for his courage. Michael read each one, humbled by the outpouring of support and reminded of why he had taken on the case in the first place. The dealership, meanwhile, began implementing the reforms mandated by the court. Training programs were rolled out, new policies were put in place, and employees were encouraged to speak up about any concerns. Richard Lewis, though initially resistant, seemed to genuinely embrace the changes, even reaching out to Michael to seek advice on fostering a more inclusive workplace. For Michael, these small victories were meaningful, but they weren't enough to distract him from the larger fight. The investigation into the security firm gained traction, with multiple agencies launching inquiries into its practices. Reports began to surface in the media, shedding light on a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond the dealership where Michael's journey had begun. One evening, months after the court ruling, Michael received a phone call from the whistleblower. Their voice was calm but resolute. "I wanted to thank you," they said, "for listening, for believing me, and for fighting for something bigger than yourself. I didn't think anyone cared enough to do what you did." Michael was struck by the sincerity of the words. "It wasn't just me," he replied. "It was everyone who came forward, everyone who refused to stay silent. Change doesn't happen because of one person, it happens because we work together." As the call ended, Michael felt a sense of closure. The fight had been exhausting, but it had also been worth it. The case had exposed truths that needed to be seen and sparked conversations that couldn't be ignored. In the months that followed, Michael continued his work, taking on new cases and advocating for systemic change. The fight against discrimination was ongoing, but with every step forward, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Reflecting on the journey, Michael realized that the most important lesson wasn't just about standing up for what's right. It was about believing in the power of collective action. The fight for justice wasn't his alone, and that knowledge gave him strength. As he packed up his office one evening, ready to head home, Michael glanced at the folder from the whistleblower, now tucked away in a drawer. It was a reminder of where he'd been and where he was going. The battle against injustice was far from over, but Michael knew he was ready for whatever came next. Because at the end of the day, the fight for fairness, dignity, and respect wasn't just worth it, it was necessary. And that truth would guide him, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be.